Hey, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you guys are coming from. Really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you a bit more about Uber Elevate and what we're up to at Uber with urban air mobility, and really tie a lot of this back into our data strategy and how we're thinking about layering in not only Uber data but a bunch of third-party data to really come up with some great insights into what urban air mobility might look like. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of what this urban air mobility thing is and kind of how StreetLight plays a huge role in our efforts to get there. This is all about cities. This is why we're here, all on this conference and at the summit. More than half of the world's population today lives in urban environments, and by 2045, that number is going to increase, to more like a $6 billion number. So we're having a massive, massive explosion of people living in urban areas and urban settings. And this is like going to be a really transformational time for all of our cities across the world. And ultimately, as these cities get bigger, right, the transportation grid is really struggling to keep up with a lot of this increased density and demand in these cities. And transportation's getting a bit slower, it's getting a bit less reliable, and this is just the nature of so many more people moving into cities. And Uber's ultimately on Earth to try to reverse this trend, whether that be Uber rides on the ground or Uber Elevate in the air. We really want to make cities smarter, better, more efficient, and safer places to live for everyone. So that's sort of what we're trying to do at Uber. There have been so many mobility revolutions over the years that have fundamentally changed the way that we move in cities, and they've really transformed how cities look, how cities feel, how people move, and the economies within those cities. So, ships, railroads, public transit, each one of these major, major steps in transportation has ultimately made things move faster and safer around cities. But ultimately, the way that these cities of the world have been expanding is into the third dimension, right? They had, if you take Manhattan, for example, you can't really go farther out or wider to expand the city. You have to go up. And ultimately, this transportation grid, or the grid that we have today, is not going to be able to keep up with the third dimensional growth of life in these cities. And this problem is just going to keep getting worse and worse. And just as skyscrapers kind of are moving up and moving up into the sky, that's what Uber Elevate's trying to do, is to bring transportation into that third dimension. So we really thought, about how can Uber be really impactful and help drive a great industry forward. And that's why in 2016, actually, we wrote the Uber Elevate white paper, right? And this was really a first principles analysis of what an urban air mobility or an on-demand urban air transportation network may look like in a city. And this was really one of the first industry think pieces on the topic, kind of really pushing this industry forward. And I'll talk a lot more about the details of what we're working on and our data strategy with this. But we've been working on this problem for quite some time now and are super excited about a lot of the progress that we've been making over the past few years. This really all started, honestly, with like a question, right? Which is, can we make a trip like this happen, right? From LAX down to the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Could we maybe take an hour to 3 hour trip in some traffic, sometimes in traffic? And could we bring that much closer to a 20, 30-minute trip with an urban air mobility business? And, this is sort of the goal. And the goal is to do this sort of trip at massive scale in cities all across the world. And, this is kind of our North Star, is to make something like this a reality. And I think the short answer is, yeah, we think we can do it, actually. But ultimately, what we've had to do is approach the problem from a blank sheet of paper, right? And we had to start from scratch and define what this sort of aircraft looks like, right? This is a fundamentally new sort of technology that was first envisioned by a guy by the name of Mark Moore at NASA. Mark was at NASA for 30 something years and really pioneered this sort of aircraft called an eVTOL, or an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And Mark is actually now our chief scientist at Uber Elevate, so we get to work with him really closely now. This new sort of vehicle is like sort of a helicopter, it's sort of a drone, it's sort of an aircraft, and it's a little bit of all three of these things. And it's really important, and this technology advancements are really critical for making this sort of industry happen. But the way that we got to this actual design and got to these requirements for this aircraft is by defining an economic mission, right? So really saying, hey, look, this is what the business of urban air mobility looks like. And we did that through data, right? We did that through UberX trips. We did that through Uber Pool trips. We did that through the mass amount of data that Uber has on how people live and breathe and move around cities. But also, we had to look at other stuff outside of Uber. So this is where StreetLight plays a massive role in us getting a lot of confidence in how these cities really operate. And I'll go into much more detail on our data strategy there, but really we define the way that this vehicle looks and the capabilities of this vehicle through data. Ultimately, right, speed, payload, and range are the three kind of requirements that you need to define. But these are, only a part of the equation for us coming up with a new sort of transportation network, right? As you guys can all imagine, at Uber scale, and to really make this a sustainable form of transportation, it has to be green, right? That is like a really, really important part of making one of these networks successful and successful at scale. So these aircraft are all electric, right? They're battery powered, all electric aircraft. And contrary to what some folks say, the technology is ready, right? The battery cells are ready, and there are amazing vehicle concepts right now flying in the air that are all electric, that are really promising, amazing vehicles. So we think that the green foundation of these vehicles is really important. Also, for folks who have lived in cities or are living in cities, right, this has to be quiet. Anyone who lives in Manhattan, who lives near any of the heliports, knows that helicopters are really, really loud. But what's fundamentally different about these vehicles is a technology called distributed electric propulsion. And effectively, what that does is on a helicopter, you have one really, really big rotor right in the middle of the helicopter. What we're doing is breaking up that one big rotor into a bunch of smaller ones all across the aircraft. And what this allows you to do is spin your blades much, much slower and ultimately actually change the frequency of the noise. So it's both quieter from a decibel standpoint, but also feels a lot different due to the difference in frequency of this vehicle. So the fundamental technology with this makes these vehicles a lot quieter. And additionally, right, makes them even safer, right? It's really important that this is a mode of transportation that people can trust. And by breaking up that rotor from one failure point to multiple across the aircraft, you're able to introduce a large margin of safety on the actual operations of this aircraft, where you can see in this image, if one rotor fails, there are many other rotors across the aircraft that can pick up the slack and make sure that you can land the aircraft in a safe manner. So these are super important for us to focus on, and safety is really at the core of everything that we're trying to do. And ultimately, we call these the four pillars of Uber Elevate. These are the things that we're really, really focusing on at Uber, but ultimately we can't do everything, right? So we have to partner with industry, we have to partner with cities in order to really see this vision come to reality. So the two things we're really focusing on partnering with are the electric aircraft and the actual physical infrastructure. So Uber is not going to be building these aircraft. We're not going to be really building infrastructure and owning infrastructure in cities. We're going to be partnering with amazing vehicle manufacturers that are building these aircraft and amazing infrastructure providers that want to build the real estate. So we're taking a really partnership forward approach with these two ones. And Uber's a software and transportation company, right? The things that we're building and the experience and expertise that we're building in-house is all on this multimodal aerial ride sharing capability and something that we're calling Elevate Cloud Services, which is really a airspace management layer that kind of sits on top of one of these networks in a city to make sure that these aircraft are totally deconflicted with each other. And if you guys think about it, when you have 100 of these aircraft flying around in a city, maybe even more one day, it's really important that there's an autonomous airspace management layer to make sure that all of these vehicles aren't crashing into each other and are deconflicted from the overall airspace. So those are the things that we're really building in-house. And just to touch on this really quick, here are a few of our vehicle partners that we're incredibly excited by, and there's a ton of momentum and movement in this industry right now around getting electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft certified, right? These things are real aircraft that are built and are flying around right now. And we feel really, really excited about all of our public vehicle partners on this screen right here who are building incredible aircraft. And there's a ton of investment going into this industry. Joby, pretty notably in January of this year, raised almost $600 million in their Series C financing round. So tons of excitement around this, and we feel really great about the vehicle concepts. So to touch on a little bit, kind of why looking at large data sets outside of Uber is really important, is to fulfill this sort of vision of a multimodal aerial ride sharing business. And what I mean by this is, you can't just land one of these aircraft in your backyard, right? What's going to be really, really important is having scaled infrastructure in cities that's distributed through the city. And the only way you can make a smart decision about how you put an infrastructure asset into a city is through data. So what we will effectively do is, look at a really, really complex problem of batching people together coming from multiple different locations on multiple forms of transportation into one single infrastructure hub, have an eVTOL take off and land to another infrastructure hub, and then have all those folks on the aircraft depart and take all their own means of transportation to their final destination. So stringing together, people being distributed across a city to fixed infrastructure nodes is something that, we spend a whole lot of time trying to solve. And the way we're really doing that is through a data-driven approach, but also through a test and, learn by doing approach. So we thought, great, we're coming up with all of these great ideas and hypotheses. Let's see if we can actually do something in the real world. And the way that we did that was through our Uber Copter product in Manhattan. So starting in 2019 for a few months, unfortunately with COVID, right, we had to suspend the service to the airport, but we ran a helicopter business from the lower east side of Manhattan to JFK, John F. Kennedy Airport. We effectively tried to experiment and run what it would look like for a real urban air mobility business. And this was a great validation point and a great proof point for us to really test a lot of these data hypotheses that we've formulated and to test a lot of the operational things we need to test to make sure that when game day comes and these eVTOLs are ready, that we're ready to run a really great business that's really able to operate well and operate effectively with the communities we're trying to serve. So ultimately, the way that we come up with all of this stuff and the way that we think about cities, this is an image of LA, is we look at Uber data, we look at StreetLight O-D data, we look at a variety of data sets to really try to understand not just where Uber trips are going in cities, because as a lot of you probably know, right, you're talking less than 2-3% of total trips in a city on each day is Uber, right? So there's a massive amount of trips that we need to consider that are outside of Uber to really get a holistic picture of how the city operates. So we'll pull a variety of different data sets to better understand where people are going. And we'll do a lot of filtering to really hone in on here are the trips and here are the sorts of trips that we really want to try to disrupt. And we'll effectively come up with these heat maps in a city of, here are the best places in LA for us to build a skyport. And it should be no shocker with this heat map, right? LAX, there's a lot of traffic in and out, and downtown LA, there's a lot of traffic in and out. So this helps us get a little bit of a bearing on, how people are actually living and interacting with their cities. And to dive into a little bit more detail on our simulation strategy, right? Elevate's been a really proud partner of StreetLight since 2017, actually. So StreetLight's been with us all along the way with our strategy of how we're actually trying to simulate these environments. But we really have a tool internally that we call Uber Flux, right? Which is the simulation engine that we've built to try to solve a lot of these tough problems. And kind of starting on the left and moving to the right on this slide, we will start with Uber and third-party movement data, which is our StreetLight O-D data sets for a lot of these cities as the foundational layer that we build everything on top of, right? And this gives us an unfiltered, unbiased view of here are the sorts of people that are moving around cities, and here's what that movement looks like on a day, on a month, on a year basis. We'll then turn around and say, okay, we need to better understand these consumers' price-time trade-offs, right? We need to know what people prefer, right? Would someone prefer taking a hour-long, subway ride versus a 30-minute Uber ride versus a 15-minute, eVTOL trip, right? And we need to really understand how people behave and how people behave in different cities, because it's really different depending on the city. So we'll send out thousands of surveys to these cities to really give us more of a data-driven understanding of how people are pricing their price-time trade-offs and how people are making choices between modes of transportation. And we'll use that as sort of the core foundation for how we do our simulation. What we'll then do, though, on top of that is you have to layer on many different types of data sets. And these are just 3 examples. We have a variety of other factors that we consider. But ultimately, we need to lay on top of this baseline origin and destination data, noise data, weather data, and airspace data to pull in other perspectives and to get other bits of analysis done on what an urban air mobility network could look like. And the important thing for us with all of this, and the reason why we're so focused on having a data-driven approach to how we think about development and go to market in cities, is because it is so important for us to take into account how these communities are going to be impacted by this service, right? So noise is a great way to think about this, and something that I think about a lot, which is, maybe there's a demand hotspot in a residential neighborhood with an elementary school and a a middle school in the neighborhood. But even as quiet as these electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft are going to be, it's still going to be a disruptive service, right? So maybe there's an opportunity for us to build something that's half a mile away, that's close to a freeway or close to an industrial zone or more of a commercial zone, because ultimately what we're trying to do is to blend these aircraft in as seamlessly and as low impact as possible into the communities that we're trying to serve. But the only way we're going to know that is by doing a comprehensive data-driven noise analysis on where we need to put infrastructure in cities. And we do a very similar approach to both weather and airspace, where obviously we want to operate in areas that have favorable weather or favorable microclimates, favorable wind. And that's a really important to have a reliable service that people can trust and depend on. So we look at a bunch of these factors and lay it on top of what this StreetLight data really gives us the basis to understand in, and are really focusing on having a very community centric, holistic approach to how we develop and how we think about going to market. And ultimately, we'll come up with the optimal places on all of these different categories and parameters that we're looking at to figure out where we need to put these skyports, right? And it's not just important to know where to put it, but it's also really important to know when to put it, right? So the sequencing of this infrastructure and the sequencing of the go-to-market plan, since this is going to take years and years to develop, is really, really important for us to understand. So we'll look at that a lot too. And ultimately, me with my finance brain and finance background, get really excited about looking at this on a total day or a total year scale and understanding, like, what does this business look like? What does the impact of these communities look like? What are volumes like? What are routes like? How many vehicles do we need? How many passengers are we helping to serve, right? So looking at this in a true holistic simulated view on what an Uber Air mission day may look like. So I get really excited about that. And ultimately, this simulation platform lets us make great decisions like, where should we do our first Uber copter route? How do we think about capacity planning in these cities? How do we think about mitigating noise and community elements to the communities that we're serving? Where to place these skyports, and ultimately driving towards a holistic citywide approach to how we think about things. So I don't have to tell you guys this. Data is awesome, and we use that as the cornerstone to a lot of our analysis. But the fact of the matter is that we have to do this in lockstep with city and local regulators that we're going to be serving. It's super, super important for us to have great relationships with the cities that we're hoping to serve one day, and the regulators that are going to be dictating a lot of what this industry looks like. Los Angeles and Dallas are the two cities in the United States that we've publicly launched that, or publicly announced that we'd like to launch from. So we have really great relationships with Mayor Garcetti's office, the city of Dallas, as well as the state of Texas. And it's really, really important for us to not only use that data to make smart decisions, but to make smart decisions with the people who are going to be, living and managing these cities. So we really try to take a forward-leaning approach on this. And one of the great proof points that I'm really excited about, that's a recent development with all this, is the city of LA and the World Economic Forum have created a working group for urban air mobility that we're a part of, and we're really excited about this opportunity to work much closer with the city of LA. And just recently, the city published a great working paper that we really helped to author, which is going to be really, really important to push forward the vision of not only what the technology needs to do for urban air mobility, but how this is actually going to interact with a city. How is it going to interact with public transit? How is this going to interact with the communities that it's serving or maybe not serving? So all of those questions are really important for us to be very forward thinking and forward leaning on. And the only way we're going to get there is to do that with the people who are leading those cities, from a regulatory and government standpoint. So we're really excited about a lot of that progress as well. Ultimately, we think that once we have a lot of these really great proof points in some of the cities that we want to launch in the United States, this is going to be a thing, and this is going to be a phenomenon that's going to totally change the world, right? And we want to do this in a ton of cities all over the world where it makes sense. And we think that a lot of these cities are going to point to the work that we're doing with LA, the work that we're doing with Dallas, the work that we're doing with regulators, and saying, hey, we want this sort of service, and we want this sort of experience. And I know that Laura's probably shaking her head at the big data dumps to come, but ultimately we want to look at every city across the world and understand how urban air mobility can play a part in helping to develop that city's transportation network. And this is something that we're really, really excited about. And obviously, this is the big, moonshot for us. So we're quite excited about it, and hope that this can make it to a city wherever you guys are soon.